Hi there, hi campers, welcome back to the blog. It is great to have you here. Johnny Matthew here. If this is your first time with us, thanks for coming. It's good to have you. If you've been before, welcome back. If you would like to support the work, by the way, you can always nip over onto the text blog itself, hit one of the subscribe buttons, and you can buy me a pint or whatever from there. But of course, you're welcome to this for nothing. So this is the first of, at least two posts. I may expand further, as these things sometimes do. But I've been thinking a lot recently about how trauma impacts children with learning disabilities, and that sent me down a kind of ADHD reading rabbit hole. So there may be lots more to come, but certainly to start with, I've split it into two. So let's get into this, and I will do the voiceover for the blog post for you. Trauma and children with learning disabilities. Number one, fundamentals. The impact of developmental trauma on children with learning disabilities. Introduction. Through my work with colleagues at TRM Academy, trauma is, of course, a major part of my working world. Lately, though, the intersection of trauma with learning disabilities has come to the fore. So the next two blog posts are going to examine this conflation. Now, I'm not an expert in learning disabilities. I think it's important to say that right at the beginning. But I've worked with this quite a bit over the years. And having read around it a lot recently in relation to some cases I'm involved with, I thought I'd just share some thoughts about how trauma can be uniquely impactful in the context of learning disabilities. And I'm going to use the shorthand LDs throughout this post, just to make things quicker and easier. All right, developmental trauma and children with learning disabilities. Childhood trauma has profound and lasting effects, shaping kids' emotional, social, and cognitive development. This much is obvious. Like humans of any age, these kids carry the wound, trauma means wound, with them long after the triggering event or events have passed. But when children with learning disabilities experience trauma, the impact is even more layered and complex. Now, I've split my thinking on this into two posts. Fundamentals and how to help. Fundamentals, that's this post, explores how developmental trauma might affect children with LDs and some differences in trauma presentation between children with and without learning disabilities. And then in the next post, how to help, I'll examine a few general approaches and practical strategies for helping these kids to heal and to thrive. Now, as always, this is a summary of the issue and is nowhere near an exhaustive, thorough coverage. So what is childhood developmental trauma? First things first. Childhood developmental trauma occurs when children experience repeated or severe adverse events during their early years. Things like abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, neglect, that's the omission of necessary positives, e.g. affection, stimulus, medical care, good food and nutrition, etc. Witnessing violence. That can be domestic violence, emotional coercion, threats, or war. And then chronic stress, which is a more general term, I guess, but there's things like living in poverty or housing insecurity and experiencing discrimination. So trauma in early childhood disrupts development, not least young brains that are highly malleable and are impacted by such experiences, which in turn can alter how children process emotions, form relationships, and learn, amongst a whole heap of other things. As Dr. Bruce Perry is credited with saying, a child growing up in trauma has a brain that has developed as if it were locked in a jar of toxic chemicals. That's my paraphrasing from memory of something I read ages ago, so apologies for not giving you a solid source on that one. You get the idea. So for children with LDs who already face challenges with things like memory, language, information processing, or problem solving, to name a few, trauma compounds these difficulties, creating unique challenges that may require specialist support. There's a lovely Temple Grandin quote with an image in the blog post, and the quote is, "The world needs different kinds of minds to work together." Now, Temple Grandin, as many of you know, is a professor and author, activist, but she's a person with autism who speaks and writes brilliantly on the subject. And I've dropped some book links into the blog post if you want to pursue any of that. Okay, how trauma affects children with learning disabilities. Here are a few broad brush issues that set the scene for how trauma impacts uniquely when laid over pre-existing learning disabilities. Number one, heightened vulnerability. Children with LDs are often more vulnerable to trauma for several reasons. For example, they may struggle to express themselves, making it harder to report abuse or neglect or to ask for help when they need it. This can range from big things like telling someone they've been abused through to simply making it known that they're in pain, for example. So they may struggle to express themselves. They're more vulnerable to bullying or abusive adults, or indeed other kids, due to being different. So essentially they're easy targets and being less likely and less able to speak up. And this is the double whammy of learning disabilities. The child's both an easy target for negative attention and more easily missed as a potential victim, laying them open for exploitation and treatment of all kinds. So they may struggle to express themselves, they're more vulnerable to bullying or abuse, and then lastly, on heightened vulnerability, they have communication delays or cognitive difficulties. And this can make it harder for them to understand, process, and communicate traumatic events. The notion that kids should just tell someone presumes that they have the wherewithal to know that that's what's happening to them. I guess that's the cognition part of it. But it also assumes that speaking up is the appropriate response, which it may well be, of course. That's the communication part of it. But all that comes in the context of an assumption that they have the ability to do those two things, to understand and to communicate. And both of those may be massively problematic for kids with LDs. So that's the first little section on how trauma affects children with learning disabilities. Number one, heightened vulnerability. So that struggles to express themselves, being more vulnerable to negative attention, bullying and abuse and so on, and then communication delays and cognitive difficulties working together to make that doubly tricky. So number two, compounding challenges. Trauma affects emotional regulation, behaviour and attention, areas that many children with LDs already find challenging. So I've got 3 bits just to underline here as examples: hypervigilance, difficulty learning, and social difficulties. So hypervigilance first. Traumatized children may feel perpetually on edge, interpreting neutral or benign situations as threatening, overreacting to mild stimuli and or seeing danger where there just isn't any. Now, obviously, this can heighten anxiety, agitation, and or distractibility in children with LDs. I guess the trick with these things is that these things all apply to all children, but we have to kind of double down and have that kind of sort of see it through the lens of the double whammy, I guess, of learning disabilities. So compounding challenges. First one is hypervigilance. Second one, difficulty learning. Children have to be settled to learn. And I've linked in the post to a fantastic book by Louise Bombay called Settling to Learn. Settling troubled pupils to learn why relationships matter in school. Highly recommended. Anything Louise writes, just buy it and read it. It's fantastic stuff. So children have to be settled in order to learn. Safety and physical homeostasis, that kind of settled bodily state, is essential in order for the cognitive faculties to do their thing. Trauma interferes with the ability to focus, retain attention, particularly in working memory, and solve problems. So children with LDs who often struggle with some of these areas anyway will struggle as a result of traumatic experiences as well. They're going to find school and education settings of any kind extremely difficult. And then thirdly, social difficulties. Both trauma and LDs can make it hard to connect with peers, leading to increased isolation and low self-esteem. Now, if your early years are spent in the turmoil of violence, neglect or abuse, then your sense of self, that kind of internal working model, and the ability to trust others generally, attachment if you like, are compromised too. And this affects the interpersonal world in a very broad way that undermines the child's ability to connect easily and safely with other people. So these are big deals, aren't they? So we've had how trauma affects kids with LDs. Number one, heightened vulnerability, struggle to express themselves, more vulnerable to bullying and abuse, communication and cognitive delays. And then number two, compounding challenges. That's hypervigilance, difficulties with learning, and then social difficulties. And then lastly on this bit, number three, just delayed development. For children with LDs, trauma can lead to further developmental delays. Now, there may be pre-existing delays, or there may be just slightly atypical developmental trajectory going on for a child, but that's a real struggle. So a couple of examples in how kids with LDs may suffer further developmental delays as a result of trauma. Three on this: a language delay, attentional challenges and hyperactivity, and the negative self-concept. So a child with a language delay may regress in their ability to communicate after a traumatic event. Any child. This makes speaking up difficult, of course, if not impossible, compounding that inner subjective confusion further still and triggering externalizing behavior that can distract supportive adults from what's really going on. So the child is struggling anyway, maybe with a language delay or communication issue, and then they suffer a traumatic event. That makes speaking up doubly difficult. It can dial down on that kind of inner conflict, turmoil and confusion. And then the behavior that they display as a result of that can be misread by other people rather than being a sign of trauma. So language delay may regress. Secondly, a child with attentional challenges may become even more unfocused or hyperactive. So the overlap of LDs, attachment insecurity, and post-traumatic symptoms like hypervigilance, agitation, heightened startle response can be nigh on impossible to interpret easily. They just become so enmeshed and it's hard to pull them apart. Children can be tagged as being stroppy or pegged with an ADHD label or just being in a bad mood, none or all of which might be true. It might be assumed that they've reached a developmental peak as well. So they've gone as far as they can, and the presentation indicates that we should stop pushing them quite so hard anymore, because they're probably not going to grow and learn any more than they've currently achieved. Now, again, that might be true, but it absolutely might not be true either. So the implications are vast for that, aren't they? So there could be a child with a language delay that will regress, a child with attentional problems that may become even more unfocused or hyperactive, and then a child with negative self-concept and poor self-esteem may feel even worse. Navigating the world as a child with LDs is hard enough, isn't it? Trauma adds a huge negative influence on the developing sense of self, making it doubly difficult to process and to move past and get back on track developmentally. It's an uphill battle for any child, but for the child with LDs, it's really difficult to build a positive personal script and or internal working model, because trauma doubles down on those challenges further still. So there you go. 3 areas: how trauma affects children with learning disabilities, heightened vulnerability, compounding challenges, and delayed development. So just some broad brush, sort of dipping our toe in the water, differences between traumatized children with and without learning difficulties. Now I've listed 4 here: emotional regulation, communication of trauma, behavioral changes, and trauma processing. Trauma often manifests differently in children with LDs compared with their typically developing peers, of course. And while both groups experience emotional, behavioral, psychological, and physical, and probably other problems, children with LDs may show unique patterns or express them differently. For example, and these are only examples, crumbs, it's hard to capture this. Number 1, emotional regulation. So typically developing children may display mood swings, withdrawal, or irritability as a response to trauma, same as adults would. Children with LDs will do the same, but those emotional outbursts or shutdowns may be more intense, frequent, or feelings may turn inward just the same, but the expression may be very different. It's, I guess, learning to read that stuff in the unique context of this child and what we know about them. That's the trick. So emotional regulation. Number 2, communication of trauma. So typically developing kids, they may verbalize the trauma through storytelling, play that looks a bit different, explaining their fears, maybe even talking about a friend, that's got something going on, or just coming straight out with it, that something's happening to them. Our children with LDs may rely much more on non-verbal behaviours and presentations that are observable by others. So it might be aggression or clinginess, refusing to go to school, some kind of self-harmy presentation. They may rely on those things to express their trauma, especially if they have limited verbal or problematic sort of communication skills. So you begin to see how intense a problem it is. So they may struggle with emotional regulation, communication of trauma. Number 3, behavioural changes, we've touched on already. So typically developing kids, behaviours like avoidance, aggression, or regressed play are often context specific. So we can see the difference around that stuff. Kids become more avoidant or aggressive, for example. And that can become tied to things like reminders of the trauma or clear triggers, and they may or may not be aware of that, or we may or may not be able to observe that. But either way, the connectedness is a little bit, it can be very complicated, but it might be a little bit more straightforward where there's no LDs there. Children with LDs, of course, that child's much less likely to be conscious of any cause and effect association. They don't see the cause and effect. And so they may react in an even less sort of directed or obviously connected way. So behaviours may seem unrelated to triggers because cognitive difficulties make it harder for them to connect cause and effect. And if it's harder for them, then it's hard for others to detect that. So again, it's that kind of double whammy, harder for them, harder for us, behavioural changes. And then lastly, number 4, trauma processing. So typically developing children can often engage in talking therapies, slightly more cognitive approaches, particularly in older kids, to process trauma. Or they may speak tangentially about things or draw pictures that give clues to the adults around them. We can harness that then to help them begin processing and kind of moving through it towards kind of healing and so on. Now, children with LDs can do, and some do, exactly the same. But they're going to need access, much more access to non-verbal approaches, therapies like art and play, that allows some expression and processing whilst also being tailored to their communication and cognitive needs. And they'll definitely need very observant adults to pick up on things in ways unique to each child. And for those of us who are trying to help kids move through this by facilitating some kind of trauma processing sort of support package, we need to be drawing heavily on the families and the adults around these kids who know them, because we don't know what the old normal looks like, so that we're presented with the post-traumatic child, if you like, with a kind of new normal, because it has this layer of trauma over their pre-existing functioning. Well, we need to know what the old normal looked like in order to be able to have any chance of interpreting the new normal, and therefore to engage optimally and help them move forward. So just 4 things there, differences between traumatized kids with and without LDs: emotional regulation, communication of trauma, behavioral changes, and trauma processing. Final thoughts. Of course, all of the above is a desperate simplification of an immensely complex pantheon of challenges. But that in itself makes the material point here, I think, that those of us tasked with caring for and supporting these kids have got our work cut out. It starts with embracing one fundamental idea, I reckon, that children of all kinds suffer trauma, feel the after effects, and need the safe people around them to be switched on and proactively focused on their needs. So when things change or the time is right to let someone know, we're ready. I got to read that again. I think it's so important. It starts with embracing one fundamental idea, that children of all kinds suffer trauma, feel the after effects, and need safe people around them to be switched on and proactively focused on their needs. So when things change or the time is right to let someone know, we're ready. So I hope this post has at least underlined that challenge and some of the reasons for and ways in which kids with LDs experience trauma and go on to respond to and indicate the need for help. In the next one, we're going to look at a few things that we can do a little bit more specifically to help. So I hope that's useful to you. Thanks for listening, guys, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.